On June 23, 1972, the President of the United States signed Title IX into law. And the statute contained exactly 37 words.
Just 37 words.
Right, 37. But here is the massive historical illusion that I feel like we all seem to have collectively accepted. 0 of those 37 words mentioned sports. Not one single word.
Yeah, that always shocks people.
It's wild. You think of a law being signed, the ink dries, and you imagine fields across America just instantly flooding with perfectly funded women's sports teams.
Like flipping a switch.
Exactly, like flipping a switch.
Yeah.
But the reality is the original statute simply said, well, it basically said you can't discriminate on the basis of sex in any education program receiving federal financial assistance.
Right.
And that single, incredibly ambiguous sentence set off this massive, like a 6-year, almost apocalyptic war over how the rules would actually be written.
It really did. Because we tend to view civil rights history in these very comforting binary terms, Like before the law, there was darkness, and then after the law, there was light.
A clean break.
Exactly. But stepping into the actual historical archives from, say, 1972 to 1978, it just shatters that clean narrative entirely. I mean, we are looking at a landscape defined by raw panic.
Oh, total panic.
Yeah, massive lobbying campaigns and just absolute institutional warfare.
So, welcome to this deep dive. Because today, we're not actually looking at the champions of Title IX.
No, we are taking a different route today.
Right. We are going to explore the fierce, incredibly organized, and frankly, exceptionally well-funded counterforce that fought this law.
And we have to do that because if you want to understand the modern landscape of college athletics, you really have to understand the genuine terror this law provoked back then.
Exactly. We are tracking the absolute financial panic of the NCAA. And how an unresolved debate from 1974 over what they called roster math is literally still driving the arguments you hear about sports funding today.
To really understand the law, I mean, we have to step out of our modern perspective, right? We have to put ourselves in the shoes of the athletic directors and the academic traditionalists of the 1970s.
You have to get in their mindset.
Totally. We have to look honestly at the economics of the time. If we just dismiss the opposition as, cartoon villains in a historical drama, we completely miss the structural logic of their argument.
And I want to start exactly there. Let's look at the ledger.
Let's do it.
Before we get into all the political knife fights in Washington, we really need to understand the economic engine of a 1970s university. Because we hear these stories of athletic directors claiming Title IX was going to bankrupt them.
Bankrupt the whole school.
Right. So were they just lying, or what did their budgets actually look like back then?
Well, stripping away the political rhetoric reveals a core structural claim made by the NCAA that was actually entirely coherent.
Okay.
At major universities, a very small handful of sports paid for absolutely everything else. Big-time college football and, well, to a slightly lesser extent, men's basketball were the sole engines of revenue.
They were the golden goose.
Exactly. Those two programs generated the massive gate receipts. They brought in the huge booster donations. And critically, in the early 1970s, the NCAA was really starting to consolidate and explode television broadcast revenue.
But hold on. If they're packing like 80,000 people into a stadium every Saturday and television money is just starting to flow in, they're basically printing money at this point.
Massive amounts of money.
So why is the prospect of adding a women's tennis team or, women's track team suddenly threatening to topple that entire empire? Like, why assume immediate bankruptcy?
Because university athletic departments did not operate like a Fortune 500 company hoarding a massive profit margin in some offshore bank account.
Right. They aren't saving it for a rainy day.
Not at all. They operated on a zero-sum spend-what-you-make model. Every single dollar of surplus that football generated was immediately reallocated to fund the rest of the department. So the football stadium paid for the men's track team, the men's golf team, the wrestling team. Every single non-revenue sport relied entirely on the financial overflow of that one massive program.
And football is an absolute behemoth. I mean, even in the 70s, we aren't talking about a casual club sport here.
Oh, no. We are talking about an industrialized operation running inside an academic institution. Just think about the footprint of Division I football.
It's huge.
You are carrying rosters of 80, sometimes well over 100 players. You have specialized coaching staffs, incredibly expensive protective equipment.
Helmets, shoulder pads that constantly need replacing.
Exactly. You have massive medical and insurance liabilities. You are literally flying 100 people across the country every other week.
And paying for all those hotels and meals.
Right, and you're maintaining these massive stadiums that require millions of dollars in upkeep. And the crucial reality of 1973 was that there was simply no women's equivalent to football that could generate a matching revenue stream to offset those massive baked-in costs.
Okay, so imagine you're listening, and you own a massive, sprawling restaurant. You have this incredible, highly profitable bar area.
A great analogy.
Right, and the bar is packed wall to wall every single night. It's selling these high-margin premium cocktails, and the profit from that bar is literally paying the lease on the entire building.
Right, it pays for everything else.
It's paying the kitchen staff, the hostesses, the electricity for the main dining room. And then a new regulation comes down and says you must spend an equal amount of money on a brand new coffee station as you do on your premium bar.
And to take your restaurant analogy a step further, the health inspector isn't just demanding a coffee station. They're demanding you take your best bartenders and your premium liquor budget and reallocate it immediately.
Right. You're terrified.
You're absolutely terrified that if you divert thousands of dollars away from that main bar, the quality drops, the crowds leave, and you basically cannibalize the only thing keeping the lights on for the entire building.
Cannibalize. That is the exact fear. Yeah. It's the fear that creating equity means destroying the golden goose. And nobody amplified this fear louder than Walter Byers.
Oh, Walter Byers, yeah.
We really need to talk about him because he is essentially the architect of this entire resistance.
Walter Byers is perhaps the most powerful figure in the history of American college sports. I mean, he was the executive director of the NCAA from 1951 all the way to 1988.
That is an incredibly long reign.
It's unprecedented. He took an organization that was basically and it's a loosely organized debating society, and forged it into a multi-billion-dollar cartel. He controlled the television rights, he controlled the sanctions, he controlled the money.
Total control.
Total control.
Right.
And his framing of Title IX between 1973 and 1974 was nothing short of apocalyptic. I mean, he went on the record warning that applying this federal law to athletics would lead to the possible doom of our collegiate sports.
The possible doom? I mean, that is a massive escalation.
It's extreme.
It's not, this will be difficult to implement. It is literally the sky is falling. But I have to push you on this, though. You said the ledger was real. The zero-sum budget was real.
Yeah, the math was real.
But was this genuine economic terror from Byers? Or was this highly orchestrated, protective rhetoric designed to just maintain a very comfortable boys' club?
See, the historical reality is that it was deeply both. And they fed off each other, which is what makes the 1970s so fascinating to study.
Okay, how so?
Well, the dual nature of this argument is key. The economic anxiety was factually based on how the budgets were currently structured. The math was undeniably difficult, but that legitimate logistical headache was fiercely weaponized.
Weaponized how? Like they used it as an excuse.
Exactly. Athletic directors and NCAA officials used the very real cost of football as an impenetrable shield. It became the perfect, socially acceptable excuse.
Oh, I see.
They could look the public in the eye and say, hey, we hold no animus against women. We would love to fund women's gymnastics, but the math just won't let us without destroying the entire ecosystem.
It's the ultimate conversation killer. Don't mess with the money.
Right. The budget won't allow it.
And with athletic directors across the country in an absolute panic about losing their football budgets, that localized campus fear quickly mobilizes and travels directly to Washington, D.C.
It goes straight to the top.
Which brings us to a massive legislative fork in the road. How did the politicians react to the threat of the golden goose being slaughtered?
Well, they took the fight directly to the floor of the United States Senate. So in May of 1974, Senator John Tower, a Republican from Texas, introduces a floor amendment.
And from Texas, no less.
Right. And it is vital to remember the context here. Texas is a state where high school and college football is practically a religion.
Oh, absolutely. It's woven into the fabric of the state.
So Tower's proposal was a brilliantly blunt instrument. He didn't want to negotiate the nuances of locker room space or travel budgets. He proposed a statutory amendment to fully exempt what he called revenue-producing sports from Title IX entirely.
Just a total, complete carve-out.
A complete exemption.
Yeah. A giant legislative wall built entirely around the football stadium.
A total wall. Under the Tower Amendment, if a sport produced gross revenue, which universally meant football and men's basketball Title IX, simply would not apply to it.
Wow. So they're just immune.
Completely immune. The federal government could audit the tennis team, They could look at the swimming pool, the intramural leagues, but they could not look at the football budget.
If we look at the philosophical logic of Tower's amendment, it is the purest manifestation of the economic fear we just untacked.
It really is.
He is validating the athletic directors. He's standing there saying, you are right. Football pays for everything, so football is legally untouchable.
Untouchable by the federal government, yeah.
And the incredible thing is, the Senate initially agreed with him. The Tower Amendment actually passed the Senate.
It did, which just shows how pervasive the fear of ruining college sports really was among lawmakers at the time. They were genuinely afraid.
But it didn't become law.
No, it did not survive the legislative process because it faced an immediate, furious counterattack led by Senator Birch Bayh, a Democrat from Indiana.
And he's a major player in this.
Huge player. Bayh was the original author of Title IX in the Senate, so he fought the Tower Amendment on the floor, basically arguing that creating this blanket exemption would completely gut the intent of the civil rights law.
Well, of course it would. I mean, if you exempt the most highly funded, culturally significant, massively visible part of college sports, you are rendering the concept of gender equity entirely meaningless.
Exactly. You're carving out the biggest piece of the pie.
You are saying equality only applies to the leftovers.
And Bayh understood that immediately. He argued that if you shield the millions of dollars pouring into football, universities would never, ever have any genuine incentive to invest in women's programs.
Because they could just hide all their money over in the football column.
Exactly. So ultimately, the Tower Amendment was deleted in the conference committee. That's the room where the House and the Senate have to basically iron out the differences in their competing bills before sending it to the president.
So the wall gets torn down before the mortar can even dry. Senator Tower loses his blanket exemption.
He does.
But the panic on the ground hasn't changed at all. Texas football still needs to be paid for. Walter Byers is out there still screaming about doom, and the athletic directors are still staring at their zero-sum ledgers, sweating bullets.
The problem was still very real for them.
So what was the alternative path Congress took?
The alternative was this massive political compromise known as the Javits Amendment of 1974. This was sponsored by Senator Jacob Javits, a Republican from New York, and this actually becomes Section 844 of the Education Amendments.
Okay, so what did Javits do differently?
Javits takes a totally different, much more subtle approach. Instead of a blanket statutory exemption like Tower wanted, the Javits Amendment directed the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare.
That's HEW, right?
Right, HUW. They were the federal agency tasked with writing the actual rulebook for Title IX. So Javits directs them to issue regulations that included, and this is the critical phrase here, reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports.
Reasonable provisions considering the nature of particular sports. I mean, that sounds so incredibly bureaucratic.
It's extremely vague.
Why does this specific phrasing matter so much? Like, what is the functional difference between what Tower wanted and what Javits actually got passed?
It is the monumental difference between a statute and a regulation.
Okay, unpack that.
So Senator Tower wanted a statutory exemption. If that passes, the protection for football is written in permanent ink by Congress. It is rigid law. Regulators cannot touch it, and courts have to enforce it.
It's set in stone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Senator Javits, instead, acknowledges the economic reality without making it a rigid law. He is publicly agreeing that, yes, football has more players, it requires costlier equipment, and has higher injury rates.
Right.
But instead of cementing a permanent shield into the actual text of the law, he hands that acknowledgement over to the regulators at HUW.
Oh, wow. He passes the buck to unelected bureaucrats.
Total punt.
He's essentially telling the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, look, we all know a massive football team costs more to run than a 5-person golf team, but we don't want to be the politicians who officially declare men's sports more important than women's sports. So, you guys figure out the math.
It is a masterclass in kicking the can down the road.
Yeah.
I mean, Congress completely avoided the political landmine of overtly legally protecting men's football at the expense of women's rights.
Which would have looked terrible for them.
Exactly. So the overt carve-out fails. But they simultaneously embed the economic terror of the athletic directors right into the very machinery of how the law will be enforced.
Because they acknowledge the sports are different.
Right. By punting this to the regulators, Congress left the absolute hardest question unresolved. They completely punted on the roster math.
And we hear this term roster math constantly in modern sports debates. Can you explain exactly how this punt created an impossible mathematical equation for the universities?
Yeah, so HEW eventually issues regulations based on the concept of proportionality.
Oh.
The simplest way to understand it is this. If your university student body is, say, 50% female, then roughly 50% of your athletic opportunities, meaning roster spots and scholarships, need to go to women.
Okay, I mean, that sounds perfectly fair on paper.
On paper, yes, it's very clean. But factor in the nature of particular sports. A Division I football team has roughly 100 men on the roster. That's 100 scholarships.
Right.
And remember, there is absolutely no women's equivalent to football. So before you even start counting the men's basketball team or the men's track team or the wrestling team, you already have a 100-man deficit.
Oh, wow. Because you have 100 men and 0 women in that specific sport category.
Exactly. To achieve proportionality, an athletic director has to magically manifest 100 fully funded women's scholarships just to balance out the football team before they even look at the rest of the athletic department.
And because of the Javits Compromise, football isn't exempt from the math. Like, under Tower, they wouldn't have had to count those 100 men at all, right?
Right. Under Tower, football wouldn't exist on the ledger. But under Javits, the 100 men count in the denominator. But Congress gave HEW no clear instruction on how to actually pay for the women required to balance them out without touching the football money.
So they created an impossible puzzle. Congress acknowledged the problem, but flat out refused to provide the solution.
They created a structural flaw that we are literally still dealing with today.
It is so fascinating to watch Washington operate like that. But while Walter Byers and the NCAA are out there fighting this massive war over football budgets and roster sizes, there is a completely different, equally vicious war happening on the exact same college campuses.
A totally different front line.
Right. And the second war has absolutely nothing to do with shoulder pads or stadium seating.
No. To understand the full resistance to Title IX, we really have to pivot away from the athletic director's office and walk straight into the admissions office.
Let's go there.
Because while the coaches were fighting for the university's wallet, the academic traditionalists were fighting for what they believed was the very soul of the university.
Okay, I want you listening to just put yourself in a totally different mindset for a moment. Imagine you are a university trustee, or like a dean of admissions, in 1974.
Right.
You have spent your entire career meticulously curating the student body of your institution. You decide who gets in, you maintain the academic prestige, you carefully balance the demographics to match your institutional vision.
It's your domain.
It's your entire world. And suddenly, the federal government knocks on your big oak doors and says, "Hi, we are going to audit how you admit students. We're going to audit how you hire your faculty. And we are going to dictate your internal policies based on our definition of gender equity."
For an academic traditionalist at a private historic university, that literally felt like a hostile invasion.
I bet.
They feared massive, unprecedented federal overreach. I mean, they thought if the government could dictate who played on the field, what was stopping them from dictating who sat in the classroom?
Right. What's the limit?
Exactly. The specific fears on the academic side were intense. They were absolutely terrified that Title IX would impose strict, rigid admission quotas.
Meaning the government would look at an incoming freshman class and say, you must admit exactly 50% women, regardless of what your applicant pool actually looks like, or regardless of their test scores.
Precisely. Now, it is crucial to state that this was a total misreading of the law.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Title IX explicitly did not mandate strict statistical quotas for admissions, but the fear of quotas was rampant anyway. Administrators argued that this federal mandate would force a catastrophic lowering of academic standards.
Wow, so they just assumed women would lower the bar?
The underlying implication was incredibly insulting, honestly. They assumed that if they were forced to admit more women to hit some perceived federal target, they would inherently have to dip lower into the academic talent pool.
They felt it would erode a university's fundamental right to control its own destiny.
And it reached a boiling point in Congress. In 1975, Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina actually introduced a bill designed to severely limit Title IX's reach, specifically framing his opposition in the name of preserving academic freedom.
Academic freedom. I mean, it's such a powerful, noble-sounding phrase. You hear that, and you immediately think of free speech, the pursuit of truth, protecting scholars from government censorship.
It's a great PR term.
It really is.
Sure.
And you can see how incredibly difficult this was for university administrators who genuinely felt caught in a vice. Because on one side, they're facing this new moral and legal mandate of equal access.
Right.
But on the other side, they have this deep-seated institutional terror of losing their autonomy to federal bureaucrats in Washington who have, frankly, never set foot on their campus.
It was a genuine clash of administrative values. But we have to apply the exact same historical reality check to the academic traditionalists that we just applied to the football coaches.
Let's do it.
Was this sincere, principled panic about government overreach? Or was academic freedom just a very polite cover story for entrenched discrimination?
Let's unpack that. Because when you look at the historical data, what they were actually doing with that so-called academic freedom is shocking.
It completely flips the narrative. I mean, while some of the philosophical concerns about federalism were undoubtedly sincere, a vast amount of the academic freedom rhetoric was a pure smokescreen.
How so?
Years later, the Department of Justice looked back at the admission practices of this era, and they found that, historically, universities were not lowering standards for women. In reality, they were holding women to significantly, demonstrably higher admission standards than men.
Wait, stop there. Higher, not lower. So they were constantly warning the public that Title IX would lower academic standards. But behind closed doors, they were actually making it harder for women to get in.
Much, much harder.
Yeah.
Because many prestigious universities operated with strict, arbitrary internal caps on female enrollment.
Oh, wow.
Right. A board of trustees might decide, well, we only want 30% of our student body to be female to maintain the traditional character of the school.
Just an arbitrary number.
Just made up. And because there were so many highly qualified, brilliant women applying for that artificially limited 30% slice of the pie, the competition was extraordinarily fierce.
Oh, I see.
A woman had to possess vastly superior grades, test scores, and extracurriculars to secure one of those limited spots compared to a man who was applying for the unrestricted 70% pool.
Let's bring this right down to the ground level, because the human element of this is just infuriating. Imagine being a highly qualified female high school senior in, say, 1973. You have done everything perfectly. You have a better GPA than the guy sitting next to you in AP Calculus. You crushed your standardized tests. You both apply to the exact same prestigious university.
You think you have it in the bag.
Right. But he gets a welcome packet, and you get a polite rejection letter. And it has absolutely nothing to do with your merit, your intelligence, or your potential.
Nothing at all.
It's simply because the university had already reached its arbitrary quota for women, and they needed to save a seat for a less qualified man just to maintain their preferred demographic ratio.
And that is the exact discriminatory reality Title IX was threatening to dismantle. So when academic traditionalists stood at podiums and claimed that Title IX would lower standards, what they actually meant was that Title IX would force them to stop artificially inflating the standards for women just to keep their enrollment numbers artificially low.
It wasn't about protecting the intellectual prestige of the university at all.
No, not at all.
It was about protecting a demographic status quo. It really grounds this highly abstract ivory tower policy fight over academic freedom in the real-world frustration of a teenager who just wants a fair shot at an education.
Exactly. And that tension in the admissions office is brewing right alongside the panic in the athletic department. Which brings us to the summer of 1975.
Okay, setting the scene.
The academic traditionalists are fighting their rearguard action, but over in Washington, the federal bureaucrats at HEW have finally finished drafting the actual binding regulations for Title IX.
The instructions Senator Javits asked for are finally written.
They are finally on paper.
Right. So on May 27, 1975, President Gerald Ford signs off on them, and they officially take effect in July of that year. So the theoretical debate is over, right? The reality has arrived. How does Walter Byers and the NCAA react when they read the final fine print of these regulations?
They go to all-out war. The NCAA launches a relentless, multi-pronged strategy.
Okay, what were the prongs?
Well, we've already seen track one, lobbying Congress, which resulted in the messy Javits Compromise.
All right, the punt.
Track two was aggressively pressuring HEW during the drafting of those rules, trying to influence how those reasonable provisions would be defined to favor football.
Makes sense.
But when the final regulations were published and the NCAA realized they hadn't gotten the sweeping, impenetrable protections they demanded, they initiated track three. They took the federal government to court.
The lawsuit. NCAA versus Califano, and Joseph Califano being the secretary of HEW at the time.
Correct. So in 1976, the NCAA officially sued the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And their core legal argument was audacious.
Or was it?
They argued that the HEW regulations, specifically the ones applying Title IX to athletics, fundamentally exceeded the authority granted by the original 1972 statute.
How so? I mean, the statute says education programs.
Well, they pointed out that athletic departments themselves rarely receive direct federal financial assistance. The university might get federal research grants for the science department, but the football team didn't. Therefore, the NCAA argued, Congress never intended for the law to reach the locker rooms.
They are basically saying, you are regulating a room in the house that you don't even pay for.
Exactly.
So they throw down the gauntlet in federal court with all their massive resources. Did it work? Like, did the judges look at the ledger, look at the potential doom of football, and agree that Title IX was illegal overreach?
This is where we run into a vital legal nuance, and it really explains why this issue remained a festering wound for decades. The federal courts never actually answered that question.
Wait, really?
The case of NCAA v. Califano never reached the merits of the argument.
Explain that for us. What does it mean that they never reached the merits?
So in the legal system, before a judge will even listen to your argument about why a law is bad or unconstitutional, which is the merits of the case, you first have to prove that you have the right to be standing in the courtroom at all.
Right, stand.
This is the doctrine of standing. You have to demonstrate to the court that you personally have suffered a direct, concrete, and particularized injury caused by the defendant.
Okay, so the NCAA walks into court, slams their massive binders of financial doom on the table, and the judge asks what?
The judge basically asks, how has the NCAA as a corporate entity been directly injured by this?
Oh.
Right. And between 1978 and 1980, the court systematically dismissed the NCAA's lawsuit for lack of standing. The judges ruled that the NCAA as an organization had not demonstrated concrete injury from the HEW regulations.
Because it's the schools that would lose the money, not the NCAA itself.
Exactly. Perhaps individual universities could claim financial injury or individual coaches, but the NCAA itself could not.
So they were thrown out on a procedural technicality.
Pretty much.
They never even got to argue about the football budgets or the roster math or the legality of the regulations in front of a judge.
Never got the chance. And because they lost on standing, the actual substantive legality of the HEW athletic regulations remained an open, unlitigated question. Title IX survived its biggest legal challenge not because it definitively won the constitutional argument, but because its biggest opponent wasn't legally allowed to make their case.
That is wild. So the legal loophole just stays wide open.
Mm-hmm.
But while we were talking about the NCAA and their massive legal war chest, we really need to address the great glaring irony of this entire era.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
And this is a historical twist that I just find absolutely fascinating. During this entire brutal 6-year fight, the NCAA, the organization screaming the loudest about Title IX, the one spending fortunes to dictate the future of women's sports, did not even govern women's college sports.
Not a single one. That is the defining irony of the 1970s. Women's collegiate athletics were governed by an entirely different, independent organization.
Right, the AIAW.
The Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, yeah.
So the NCAA is out here in Washington acting like they are defending the entire realm of college sports, but they don't even own half the kingdom. Let's compare these two bodies. What was the AIAW actually doing while Walter Byers was predicting the apocalypse?
The AIAW was operating on a fundamentally different philosophy of what sports should even be.
How so?
Their institutional goals were deeply, intentionally student-centric. They promoted a purely educational model for women's sports. In fact, early on, the AIAW was explicitly against athletic scholarships.
Wait, they didn't want scholarships.
No. They believed that tying a student's education to their physical performance on a field actually corrupted the academic experience. They were actively resisting the hyper-commercialized, win-at-all-costs, multi-million-dollar entertainment model that the NCAA had built for men.
So the AIAW is looking at sports and saying, let's use athletics to build character, enhance physical health, and support the academic journey of the student.
Right, it's about the student.
Meanwhile, the NCAA is looking at sports and saying, let's protect our multi-million-dollar television broadcast monopolies.
It's completely divergent.
When you lay it out like that, the motives become glaringly obvious. The NCAA's fierce existential opposition to Title IX wasn't about protecting women. It wasn't about fairness. It was purely about money, control, and protecting their absolute monopoly over the revenue engine.
It was institutional self-preservation in its purest form. The NCAA viewed the AIAW, and by extension Title IX, as a direct threat to their business model. And it is incredibly revealing to look at what happened in the years that followed.
What did they do?
Well, once the NCAA exhausted its legal options, once they realized that Title IX wasn't going away and that women's sports were now legally mandated to grow and receive massive new funding, their strategy shifted entirely.
If you can't beat them in court, buy them.
Exactly. If they couldn't defeat Title IX, they decided they needed to control the massive new market it was creating. In the early 1980s, the NCAA essentially engaged in a hostile corporate takeover of women's sports. They began offering their own women's championships, using their massive financial leverage to lure schools away from the AIAW. They literally crushed the AIAW, forcing it to fold, and completely absorbed women's athletics into their own highly commercialized model.
They legislated and outspent their rival out of existence. It's ruthless.
Completely ruthless.
But let's get back to the timeline of the law itself. We left off with the HEW regulations taking effect in July 1975. Now, the government didn't just drop the hammer immediately and demand instant equity, did they?
No, they didn't. They gave universities a 3-year grace period to get their massive athletic departments into compliance.
Which again shows the immense political power of the opposition. I mean, 3 years is a massive runway to adjust your budgets, figure out the roster math, and build new facilities.
It's a huge concession.
So the clock starts ticking in July 1975, and it finally runs out on July 21st, 1978. That is the hard deadline. The transition period is officially over. The law is fully active. So I have to ask the ultimate question. After all the panic, all the lobbying, all the Senate floor speeches, what actually happened? Did the apocalyptic predictions of Walter Byers come true? Did college football die?
No, college football did not die. In fact, it exploded.
It got bigger.
Exponentially bigger. If you look at the real-world economic effects post-1978, big-time football revenue just skyrocketed. Television contracts left the millions and entered the billions over the ensuing decades.
Right, we're talking huge broadcast deals.
Massive deals. Stadiums didn't shrink. They expanded to hold 100,000 people. Coaches' salaries went from comfortable to astronomical. The economic engine that the NCAA was so terrified of losing remained completely intact, and frankly, it thrived under the Title IX era.
Okay, so the restaurant's premium bar is still packed, making more money than ever before. The doom never arrived. But there is a darker reality to this aftermath. There were massive unintended casualties to this whole saga.
Unintended, but completely predictable.
Right. Because Congress punted on the Tower Amendment, they refused to explicitly legally exempt football. But because they passed the Javits Compromise, they told regulators to consider the nature of particular sports. So schools were left to figure out this impossible roster math entirely on their own, essentially in the dark.
And this is exactly where the squeeze happens. This is the direct result of Congress refusing to make the hard choice back in '74.
Right, because if you are an athletic director in, say, 1979, the federal law says you must provide mathematically equitable opportunities for women.
Right.
So you have to add women's teams, you have to fund them, equip them, and provide scholarships. But culturally, politically, and financially, you absolutely cannot touch the 100 scholarships allocated to the football team.
The football coach is usually the most powerful man on campus.
Exactly. So if football is untouchable, where does the money come from? Where do the scholarship spots come from to balance the proportionality equation?
They came from the men's minor sports, the non-revenue sports.
The casualties.
Because football was functionally protected by its sheer cultural and revenue power, but it wasn't legally exempt from the proportionality math of Title IX, right? So the financial and roster squeeze had to hit somewhere else on the ledger.
The men's wrestling team, the men's gymnastics team, the men's swimming and diving programs.
Exactly. To balance the ledger and to create the required roster spots for women without touching a single dollar of the football budget, universities began systematically cutting those men's Olympic sports programs. And this traces a direct, undeniable structural line from the political compromises of the mid-1970s straight to the contemporary debates we are having today.
This is the exact origin of the unfair to men argument. You hear it constantly in modern sports media. Every single time a college announces they're cutting a men's track team or a men's rowing team, the immediate knee-jerk reaction from alumni is, Title IX did this, Title IX killed men's sports.
That's always the headline.
Always. But when you look at the granular history we just discussed, it wasn't the 37 words of Title IX that killed the wrestling team. It was the unresolved cowardice of the Javits Compromise.
It's the punt.
By recognizing that football was different, But failing to explicitly shield it from the math, Congress created the exact high-pressure conditions that forced athletic directors to chop men's minor sports just to balance the scales.
It is a structural flaw built right into the very implementation of the law, and it is a flaw born entirely of the economic anxiety of 1974. The anger is almost always directed at women's sports, or at Title IX itself, when historically, the anger really should be directed at the untouchable status of the football roster.
Think about the student perspective on this today, right now. You have a male gymnast in 2026 who loses his collegiate scholarship because his program gets abruptly cut.
Devastating for him.
Oh, completely. But he is experiencing the direct, real-world fallout of a legislative compromise that was struck in a closed-door conference committee in Washington, D.C. over 50 years ago.
It's wild to think about.
He is paying the physical price for the fact that politicians in the 70s didn't want to anger the powerful Texas football lobby, but also wanted to look progressive on gender equity to the rest of the country.
The past is never really past, right? The roster math established in 1975 is still the dominant defining equation in every single athletic department in the country today.
Okay, let's zoom out and summarize this incredible journey. The first 6 years of Title IX were just an absolute gauntlet. We have to stop thinking of it as a magical wand that instantly fixed society.
It was a brutal fight.
It had to survive Walter Byers and the NCAA's relentless, well-funded lobbying machine. It had to survive Senator Tower actively trying to build a legislative wall around revenue sports on the Senate floor.
And it had to survive the academic side, too.
Right, the outrage of the academic traditionalists who tried to hide their discriminatory admission caps behind the noble veil of academic freedom. And of course, it had to survive a federal lawsuit that went all the way to the brink.
And while the law ultimately survived, and while it unquestionably transformed American society and unlocked the potential of millions of women, it survived with a massive built-in tension.
That tension is still there.
By refusing to answer the football question cleanly, by neither fully exempting it nor fully forcing it to shrink its massive footprint, Congress basically guaranteed that the financial terrors of 1974 would become permanent, defining fixtures of college athletics.
Which leaves us with something incredibly deep to chew on. Think about the NCAA's original core motivation back in 1973. They fought Title IX's tooth and nail. They claimed it was the doom of sports. But really, they were fighting to protect their total control, their absolute monopoly over men's sports, and the massive revenue it generated.
Their entire goal was preserving their empire against federal intrusion.
Right. But consider this wild twist of historical fate. Did the ultimate unstoppable success of Title IX actually force the NCAA to conquer women's sports too, just to maintain that monopoly on the money?
That's a fascinating theory.
They realized they couldn't stop the women from playing. The law simply wouldn't let them. So they decided they had to own the tournament.
They had to control the product.
Exactly. So the next time you sit down to watch a massively lucrative, nationally televised women's college basketball tournament, a tournament generating millions in ad revenue, heavily branded with the NCAA logo, ask yourself this: how did the fiercest, most existential enemy of this civil rights law maneuver itself to become the ultimate financial beneficiary of its mandates?
It is a profound question of history, institutional power, and capital, and it is a story that is still writing itself today.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We invite you to keep looking past the simple, clean narratives and keep questioning the deeply complex history behind the headlines. See you next time.